Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to be talking about view components. So view components are new in ASP.NET Core, and they replace a previous bit of functionality in earlier versions of ASP.NET MVC. In prior versions, you were able to call actions on controllers from within views. In ASP.NET Core, you can no longer do that. Instead, you can call view components. Now, view components are very similar to partial views, except for in one very important way. When we were working with partial views in the earlier video, we had a parent view that called the html.partial method, and that parent view already had a model with data in it. Now, when that parent view called the partial method, it would pass along either all of or part of the model to that partial view. Then the partial view would be passed back into the parent view along with the HTML and the razor and whatever might have been the model data. View components handle this interaction very differently, but in a very significant way. The parent view, you'll notice, is using the await operator, and then it calls the component.invoke async method. You'll also notice that the parent view does not necessarily have to have a model. That's because when the parent view calls the view component, which acts very similar to a controller, that view component will actually construct the model for you. Then you can pass that model to your partial view, and then you can return that partial view back to the parent view and display it inside of that parent view. This distinction is very important in two key ways. First, it means that there's added flexibility for where you can call a view component from within your application. It doesn't necessarily have to be called from within a regular view. It can be called from within a view layout. The second way that this is significant is in separation of concerns. Having the model being created by the view component rather than by the overall controller that calls the parent view means that you don't have to worry about any of the second, third, or fourth level of data that's going to be passed into the parent view. You only have to worry and focus about the data that goes into the parent view from that controller. And then all of the view components that get called thereafter can create their own models. This separation of concerns means that view components are much more portable and can be used in virtually anywhere within your application. Let's go ahead and hop into our Visual Studio window and let's create a view component and see how this can be useful. So one of the most common uses for a view component is to call it from within a view layout, and that's because a view layout does not have any model data. Since that responsibility is left up to the view component, that makes this as an ideal fit where a view layout can call a view component. Now for this demonstration, what I'd like to do is I'd like to call a random customer from our AdventureWorks database dim customer table. And I'm going to display that customer information here underneath this HR tag so that it appears above our footer but below the body of our view. So I'm going to go ahead and just right here, even though I haven't built my view component yet, I'm going to call the await operator, and I'm going to use the component.invoke async method. There we go. Now the invoke async method accepts 6 different overloads. The first one is where it just takes the name as a string of the component you want to invoke. So I'm going to go ahead and call this customer info. Now just to point this out, if I scroll down here and look at the other overloads here, we can see that there is another option that takes an object of arguments, and we're going to be using that a little bit later because this particular thing I know has tripped me up several times. It'll trip a lot of people up if I don't cover it, so I just want to point that out. There are 6 overloads, but you don't need to pass in any sort of parameters other than just the name of the component at this point. Now the next thing to talk about is where we want to create our view components at. So I'm going to go to my Contoso RTM root folder, and I'm going to go ahead and add a new folder, and this is going to be called View Components. Now inside of this View Components folder, I'm going to go ahead and select Add class. And you'll notice if you go to the ASP.NET section, you'll see that there is no item here for view components. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. It would seem like it would be a pretty simple thing for them to do, but they don't. And I really don't know why, because sometimes view components are hard to realize everything that you got to put inside of them to make them work. So I would really appreciate it if they did create a template for view components. But for right now, we're going to be okay to just go ahead and add a class, and we'll make this view component work for us. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and name my view component customer info view component. Now, something interesting about view components is that just the simple naming of my view component with this view component appended to the end of the name of my class is enough to make this a view component. In other words, it doesn't have to inherit from anything. However, there is a view component class as an abstract class, and we need to bring in the namespace here. But that is also something you can do. So you can inherit from the view component abstract class if you'd prefer, or you can use the name, the convention of the name here with view component at the end, or you can do like what I've done here where I've just done both. And I kind of like doing both because, number one, having that view component at the end of my name of my class helps me identify this as a view component. And then also saying that it inherits from the view component abstract class means that I can easily identify where what the different members of this class are. So I can go to the definition here and I can see all the HTTP context, the model state, the request URL, etc., etc. So you may notice as you're going through these members that there's one member that's conspicuously missing, and that would be the invoke async method. And I'm not really sure why this decision was made. I'm not really sure why the developers decided to leave a member that is essentially required in order for this class to work. They just left it out of the abstract definition, and I'm not entirely sure why. I'm sure somebody could come along and tell me. But that does mean that we need to just know ahead of time that we need to create this invoke async method. Now, since it is an async method, it's going to be a public method that returns, well, I should say it's going to need to use the async, boy, if I could spell. There we go, the async keyword, and it's going to return a task of I view component result. Okay? So just know that you need to return a task of I view component result. And the name of this method, of course, is invoke async. And we're not passing any parameters to it at this point. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is grab that random customer from our customer list, or our customer table. And to do that, I need to create an instance of our AdventureWorks context. So we'll do AdventureWorks context. We're just going to call this context and set it equal to new AdventureWorks context. And I know, yes, several people are probably screaming and throwing their sodas at their monitors and yelling at me. You should not be instantiating a context here like this inside of a class. You should be using dependency injection. I understand we'll be talking about dependency injection later on in another video, but for right now, we just need to go ahead and create that context so we can continue with the demonstration. So in order to get my random customer, I need to create a random value. So I'm just going to go ahead and create an int here. I'm just going to call this rand and set it equal to a new random. And the random class has a next method on it, and the next method will give you a random number between a high and a low value. So we're going to do, now I'm going to take these values. We're looking for the minimum value for our customer key. The lowest value on a customer key column in our dim customer table was 11,000. And I don't remember exactly what the maximum value was, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this at 11,111. So that's going to be our minimum or maximum value for our rand, variable here. So Now that we've got that, we can go to our context by doing var customer, or cust, we'll just call it var cust. And we're going to go to context, dim customer, and we're going to get the first or default async. Okay, now this async method you're going to need to bring in using the Entity Framework core namespace. So I'm going to bring in that using statement. And since this is going to be an async method, that means we need to use the await operator. And now we can do C goes to C dot customer key equals rand. Okay, so that way we're grabbing a random customer based upon this generation of this random number between 11,000 and 11,111. So now that we have our customer selected, we can go ahead and return a view method. Now notice that the view method is very similar to a controller view method. And essentially that's kind of what we're doing here. We're going to be returning a result, a view component result, very similar to what we would do with a controller. And along with, very similar to how a view method works on a controller, you can have, you have 4 different overloads. We have one where we don't say anything about a model, or we don't pass in a view that we want to use, or we can pass in a view name as a string, right? Similar again to how we have the view method on a controller. We can pass in a model, right? Like we could with a view method on a controller. And then we could do a 4th option, which is to declare or specify the view that we want to use, and then pass along the model to that view. So this is very similar to that view method that we found on our controllers back up here for our MVC architecture. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and just pass along our customer, okay? So I'm not going to declare which view I want to use. I'm just going to pass the model along with our along to our view. So now this next step can be a little confusing, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure why. Again, this is one of those decisions that was made that kind of defies a little bit of logic, but I'm sure there's some reason, there's some thread of thought that made this happen. But trying to figure out where you need to create your views in order for view components to work is a little bit weird. So if you're going to be calling a view component from within one of your controllers, right? So, or I shouldn't say from within one of your controllers. Let's say that you're using the home controller and you're calling the home index method on the home controller. And that index method calls the layout, the view layout here. And then our view layout is then going to call the customer info view component. Then what we would need to do is underneath the home folder of our views folder, here we would want to create a components subfolder. And this components subfolder would hold all of the components that we might call from one of the views within our home controller. Okay, I hope you guys are with me so far. Now, this components folder needs to have another folder underneath it that is the name of the component. So that would be customer info. So I have a subfolder underneath my home folder called components. And then underneath that, I have a customer info subfolder. And now you would think, and I know that this would make sense, that the name of my view should probably be something like either Invoke Async or customer info. That would make a lot of sense. But instead, for view components, the default name for a view, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new view here, is, drum roll please, default. I know, really makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Not even index, right? They call it default. Again, one of those mysteries of life. Why did they name it the way that they did? But it is what it is. So there we go. So that is what you would want to name your view if you're going to just be calling the view method and not passing in the name of the view that you want to use. Now, you could, of course, as one of the overloads, pass in the view name that you want to use. So I could just say, default if I wanted to. But I wanted to show you guys that that's what it is. Our default view is going to take a model type, and declare it a dim customer because it's expecting a customer. And now for our default view here, let's say first name is going to be model, capital M, dot first name. And let's just add an NBSP, and we'll do last name is going to be model dot last name. And let's do a line break here. We'll do email is going to be model dot email address, and NBSP phone number is going to be the model. Wait for it. Phone. There we go. Okay, so we've got our view built here that is going to essentially be that partial view that is going to be displayed whenever our customer info view component is called. Okay, so that's the view that we're going to use. And once again, our layout, our view layout is calling, it's using the await operator to call the invoke async method on the component object. We're passing along a string that is the name of the component, which is customer info. We created a customer info view component underneath this folder called view components. That's in our root directory. And then inside of that, we have our customer info view component class, which you can either use the name convention with view component, or you can derive from view component the view component abstract class. And then we just need to create an invoke async method that returns a type of task that, of course, it uses this async keyword to make sure that whoever is calling it knows that this is an asynchronous call. We do need to have at least one operator. Since we're making this an async call, we need to have at least one operator or function that returns a type of task. And that would be this first or default async method. And we're again using the await operator for that. And then finally, once a value is returned back, we can call this view method. The view method will return the default view and pass along the cust object here, which is a random customer, to our default view, and then that of course gets displayed in our partial view. So there is the full explanation of how that all works. Let's see it in action. So here we have above our footer, but below our view, we have some information about Emily Johnson. And if we just quickly refresh here, we'll see that we get a different random customer from our database. And we can click this as many times as we'd like, and we get random customer information every time. So now that we've got that done, I'd like to show you something that I think trips up a lot of people when they try to use view components. It certainly tripped me up a few times, especially the first times I tried to use it. And that was, what if during this call to invoke async, I wanted to just pass along that random number. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do new random, and this is where I'm going to do my next, and it's going to be between the 11,000 and the 111,000, or I should say 11,111. There we go. So that is where I would want to pass along my value, right? So I've got this random value that's going to be between 11,100 or 11,111. So instead of deciding what that random value is here in my component, I'm actually going to pass it along as a parameter. So in that case, I'm just going to call this an int called rand to satisfy that that is the value I want to use there. So, okay, now that that's in place, you would think this should work, right? I got my random value being created here, and it's being passed along to my customer view component there. All right, let's go ahead and run this. What you might end up with is this object reference not set to an instance of an object, and it's failing on where it wants to use the model first name and model last name. So let's just kind of take a look and see what's going on here. I'm going to set a breakpoint here before it declares our customer. Or actually, better yet, let's go ahead and try to do it after it creates our customer. So I'm going to just hit the refresh here. And if we look at the random value, we see we just get 0, which is not between that 11,000 and the 11,111 that we were expecting. And that's because Invoke Async method is very similar, again, to an action call, where we're defining this parameter here that's supposed to be passed into it. Now, with the controller actions, remember that we named this parameter, and then when we called it in the URL, we were able to pass along something like rand equals 11,109 or something like that, okay? So you might be able to do something like that, but that's not what we're doing here, because you'll notice that we're just passing in a value, a new random value here. There's no declaration. There's nothing that helps this invoke async method. It doesn't know what is being assigned to this rand parameter. So the way you have to solve this is you create a new instance of an anonymous object. So we're going to do new, and we're going to create an anonymous object, and now we define that rand equals the value from our randomly generated value here. Okay, so we have to pass it in as a anonymous object. That will really trip you up a lot. I've done that so many times where I've tried to pass in some sort of part of a model or an object or something to the invoke async method, and I didn't wrap it in this anonymous method, and it just really made things go all haywire. So I'm just going to continue this. It's going to error out here on me, but now if I try to refresh it, we should get everything working again. There we go. So Jill Jimenez, the AdventureWorks phone number, and if I refresh it, notice that each time we get a perfectly valid response. So just keep that in mind. If you are planning on passing along a parameter to that invoke async, then you just need to wrap that up in an anonymous class. So there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe to this channel. And for those of you who have stuck around, I've got a very special little thing here I'm going to show you right now. Oh my God.